August 31st, 1886, Charleston, South Carolina. The air hung with the damp perfume of pluff mud and blackwater reeds, a breath before midnight when the earth remembered its old anger and shuddered through the low country like a chained beast yanking free. Before going on, tap subscribe to The Pale Fear for more deep-boned American dread. Drop a comment with where folks are watching from, and share the time on the clock right now. The brickwork groaned, rice trunks creaked in the marsh, and every silent cruelty that had ever been swallowed by these tidelands rose with the first long tremor. This is a story of flooded fields and buried names, of wooden gates that governed rivers and men, and of a promise made under moon-pale Spanish moss by a man called Solomon, who learned to measure time not by bells or calendars, but by the rises and fallings of water. Before anything else, drop a hello to The Pale Fear, and tap subscribe to keep this kind of deep-cut American dread coming. Also, where are folks watching from, and what's the time on the clock right now? The night the world broke, the low country answered like a great drowned organ, each forgotten rice dike and abandoned causeway singing a note only the marsh could hear. The tides had already turned, the cooper breathing out as if to steady the city, but the ground stuttered and spoke of old debts while shutters clapped like prayer books closing on shaking porches painted a thin heaven color to trick the dead. Some ceilings had that soft haint blue, a superstition that began with people who carried tides and ancestors in their mouths, who knew that spirits disliked crossings and could be fooled by a sky you made yourself with pigment and hope. This city had learned to paint its fear into shade and wood grain. It learned to keep its doors the color of safe water and its nights the hue of warning. But beneath every polish was a seam cut by rice and blood, and beneath that seam lay stories that could not be painted over. That evening, masonry cracked, church bells swung wild, and somewhere among the rattling raccoons and the drumming of unsecured shutters, the memory of a trench, the length of a family plot opened in the mind of anyone who had ever listened long enough to the wetlands to hear names spoken back. The earthquake would make the papers, the other thing would not. The other thing had already been written into the ground a century earlier, when the first embankments were piled against the cypress, and the first trunks were wedged into sluices, the water taught to kneel and rise on command like a patient slave. The wealth that built spires and sugar silver had been coaxed from a woven maze of dikes, trunks, and reservoirs, a hydraulic empire called ingenious by men who never put their hands to the mud except to wipe it away. Before Solomon, there was only the system, and before the system, there was a forest that breathed differently. A reserve is what the planters called the big dead pool, a kind of inland sea they made by running earth across streams until the water agreed to stay and serve. A trunk is a wooden throat that lets the water pass when told. From the reservoir, water ran into squares of rice that had been cut and leveled until the wind could brush them like fallen fur. These squares were patient, and they required hands that knew how to read them, when to flood, when to drain, when to weed, when to push a blade through 1,000 small stalks. The planters took the credit, the enslaved took the heat and the egg and the plagues of mosquitoes that wrote prayers in welts on their arms. The fields were not green, not at first, not to the ones who tended. Early on they were a brown grammar of the earth, a script the enslaved translated each day with their backs, lifting phrases of mud and water into grain that would travel by barrel to the tables of men who never said the names of the people who grew it. Charleston glittered behind this grammar. Cobblestones shone, drawing rooms filled with imported oil shine and mirror glass. To the west, in the labyrinth of rivers, miles and miles of earthen embankments held back the wild. The trunks in their slots were the chests of obedient animals, opening and closing on command, breathing for the crop. Solomon was tall and quiet in a way that made folks misunderstand him. He had a scar along his left wrist, a half moon where a trunk gate had slammed and pinched him years back when he was learning how to speak water fluently. It was his mother, Leah, who taught him the grammar. She worked in the weeders' gang in her girl years, graduated to tending gates by the time Solomon was big enough to be handed a hoe, and she told him not to fear the gates or the roaring of a sudden drain. The fear, she said, belonged elsewhere. She would gesture out beyond the embankments at the horizon line that trembled where heat met the sea, and say the fear lived where paper did, where tall men wrote down numbers and called them truth. She died in a late summer fever 2 years after a hurricane chewed the mouth off the Combahee and left fish rotting in the rice squares like dropped knives. Solomon buried her in a field that was not a field, because the ground there was a map of work, not a place for laying down. He put her where the dike met the trunk, near the rotted stump of a cypress that had been left like a sentinel, and he whispered a name he did not repeat, a name she said to call on when the time came. For a while, time did not come. Days did. Work did. The masters changed the way men changed chairs in the same drawing room. Some sold, some died, some found themselves too solvent to bother visiting their own earth except in winter when mosquitoes were slow enough to swat without looking. But there was one house, one family, 9 names that threaded like a needle through Solomon's years. And the thread was coarse enough to chafe. Early on, he noticed how their carriage wheels hardly threw mud. They moved as if the roads were paved for them alone. He saw their crest on the trunk marker, a tiny sunburst chiseled into a post where there should have been numbers and nothing else. He learned their pattern. They liked high water late, longer floods, tighter drains. It meant more mosquitoes and sickness in the quarters, but a shinier grain in the barrels, a kind of gloss that fetched a price at the wharf. They were careful about their gloss and careless with everything that made it. Careless with Leah. Careless with a boy who once slipped between boards and drowned in a sluice while men argued about a latch. Careless with a girl who was sent to the main house and came back a winter later with 2 names in her mouth and a scar between them where silence had been stapled. Solomon carried these names like stones in a pocket he never emptied. In time, the 9 men grew into their seats. A patriarch with a throat like a frog and fingers that drummed anything would. 2 sons who smelled of bay rum and impatience. A lawyer cousin who visited in August every year and counted everything out loud as if sound made numbers truer. 3 overseers across the years, mean in distinct ways like sharpened tools that each had a preferred cut. And 2 in-laws, merchants who could not distinguish a rice trunk from a door jamb, but who knew the wharf schedules by heart. The 9 of them were not always together, but in Solomon's mind they were a geometry, a pattern of keys hung on the same ring. By then, the city had started to warn in small ways. The rice money thinned, blanched like driftwood. Some fields went to sleep. You could tell the old squares where the dikes slumped and the water tried to reweave the marsh. In town, the glitter stood. No one liked to throw away mirrors, but the papers grumbled about tremors no one felt and aftershocks that belonged to other places. When Solomon walked the causeway at dawn, he could sense a shift in the way the herons spoke to their reflections, a humming behind the cattails, as if the ground had a beehive in it. He learned to put his palm on the dike and listen as if it were a chest. On a December morning, he felt a heartbeat that had no man in it. That winter, the family with the crest held a supper at the big house upriver, inviting a selection of men who knew how to sign papers leading down to other papers. Solomon was tasked to tend the gate at the reserve and to keep the water high for the flood that would follow the night meal, a late winter practice that starved a certain pest and fattened certain stories in town about the ingenuity of men who had merely been taught by those they owned. He went at sundown to the reserve and checked the lever. He walked the rim, finding the soft places where footprints carry bad news forward. He spoke to Leah in his chest and asked whether the time was this year or 3 more. The names were heavy. He had learned to be strong without showing it. When the moon rose, big and chip-boned, the trunks at the feeder creaked like old teeth settling in a glass. He imagined 9 men seated under a chandelier. He imagined their knives. He imagined butter sliding on grain. He imagined a silver bowl of river shrimp they would pretend grew in the barrel itself. He imagined the way the lawyer would flick his fingernail against the side of his glass when he needed attention, and the way people would pretend not to hear. He imagined the girl with 2 names, and he imagined what it might mean to ask the water to swallow something on purpose, as opposed to suffering it by accident when someone slips, when someone is careless. The word for this kind of imagining is planning, but he treated it like prayer. To plan without saying it out loud is a way of avoiding certain punishment. To plan in the language of the marsh is to ask whether the tide agrees. He spent a week tracing lines with a stick in the soft earth beyond the levee, mapping which dike segments would fail in sequence like a row of vertebrae giving up. He learned where the men walked when they toured the reserve, which path they preferred because it kept the gnats out of their eyes by using a brackish breeze. He learned that the best place to be when a dike fails is lower than your enemy and farther from straight lines. He learned that the reserve itself will swallow sound if the wind comes from the north. He learned to count backward from 9 to 1 and stop before none. The city pulsed with balls and sermons that season. A minister preached about the trembling of the earth in distant countries and said the Lord was a hand that could fit under the city and tip it like a bowl. The listening men smiled with their mouths and wrote checks with their hands, then folded their napkins in the evening just so and waited for a late frost that never arrived. In the quarters, people painted the walls of their sleeping porches a blue that made bugs hesitate and made certain elders breathe easier. On a Sunday, a bottle tree sang in the wind like a bell's cousin, and the children asked why glass was a good catcher of things they had been told were made of air. The answer was that blue works on fear the way water works on fire. The answer was that sometimes paint is not paint, but a little treaty made with a thing that wants in. Solomon did not make treaties. He taught himself where wood swells when it tastes fresh water after a week of salt. He taught himself where iron nails give up their ghosts first. He taught himself to read a seam in the levee the way his mother read lips. He traced, revised, erased with his heel, traced again. He marked all 9. He kept a map inside his body where the big organs are. He did not tell anyone. Secrets are not kept in mouths. They are kept in routines. He walked the same path so often his footsteps became part of the ground's memory. The birds stopped treating him like news. He carried tools that could be called other things. A pry bar might be a hoe. A plug cutter might be an old spindle. A coil of rope might be for a gate, which it was. He did not speak in raised tones. He did not stand too long where a man on a porch might notice. He did not rush. Anything that looks easy took a century. On a heat-fogged afternoon in June, one of the overseers, this one with a beard like wire and a habit of humming a hymn that had lost its words, found Solomon at the feeder trunk inspecting the jams. He called out in a voice that always ended in a question, as if he never quite believed the things he said. He asked why the reserve level looked high for a Sunday. He asked whether the north culvert had been cleared. He asked another question about gaskets that did not exist. Solomon nodded in a slow rhythm and kept his answers plain. High on Sunday means easy on Monday. The culvert was a bottleneck. He had cleared it. The gaskets were in good working order. The overseer passed on, satisfied for reasons Solomon understood because he had learned the weak points in men were like the weak points in wood, usually at the nuts. The 9 were not always 9 at once, but in late August they met for a tour and a count. The patriarch had grown more frog than man. The lawyer cousin had a cough that he insisted was seasonal. The sons had added stiff collars to their impatience. The overseer with the hymn was gone, replaced by a quieter man whose cruelty was administrative, numbers written in columns where other men kept their fury in clenched fists. The 2 in-laws rode down from town on horses that did not like the smell of brackish water. The animals tossed their heads when the reserve came into view, and one in-law patted a flank as if to persuade a friend, though everyone could see he and the horse were strangers. They stepped onto the path that made gnats think twice. They admired the reserve as if it were a lake placed for their reflection. They spoke of springs and of the need to deepen a channel that did not exist. They spoke of barrels due on Wednesday. They spoke of a dance that would benefit a hospital and benefit them more. When they tired of speaking, they let the overseer count aloud. He counted boards. He counted the pegs in a fence. He counted things no one else would count to make it seem as if he did a job only he could do. He did not count the way the dike felt beneath his soles, springy where it should be firm, firm where it should be forgiving, edges newly brushed by rushes that had not learned the feel of men. He did not count the way water marks its own hunger along a bank like a dog waiting to be called. What no one noticed but Solomon was the wind's small turn. When the wind on that path curls from the east, the reserve's skin ruffles differently, and sound goes south, dragging voices into the reeds. He watched the ripples cross like arguments. He was close enough to see the lawyer's cough tighten his eyes, far enough that the men would forget he had eyes at all. He had timed this, and then mistimed it, and then timed it again. The ground was humming. The city was not yet shaking. But the earth had begun to think about how much it could hold and how long it might want to hold it. The reserve held the thought too. The first failure in a dike is never the bit that looks worst. The bit that looks worst is a decoy that water makes to teach men their own arrogance. Solomon had gone to the good-looking place with his heel and pressed until he felt the bone of the earth's opinion. He had put a plug there that was shaped like a question. A question is what you ask before you take a life. The water, when ready, pushes a question into an answer. It began with a sigh that men mistake for wind in sawgrass. It continued with a shiver that men mistake for nervousness. It continued still with a popping like knuckles, and then the whole idea of the dike in that spot decided to be a different thing entirely. The right side slumped, the left side held steady, which is worse, because it makes an angle water loves. The men on the path stepped backward without thinking, as one does from a snake, and in doing so they formed a cluster that had weight enough to make the next part go easily. Water likes to be invited like that. It came forward with a low growl, and the overseer's numbers went out of his head. If the reserve had emptied at once, the 9 would have run, scattered, and talked. But the reserve was not a fool, and neither was Solomon. He had drawn his little map by the way a lung empties, not a shout, but a long exhale, tidal and patient and particular. The second failure happened where the path narrowed between 2 sycamores. The earth gave a shrug, men blinked at the sudden slant, and the path became a trough. The trough filled in a heartbeat. Shoes lost their leather argument with silt. The old patriarch did a slow half-pirouette and found his cane was not an anchor, but a skewer that made him wobble once and then settle into the mud up to the knee. When men sink to the knee, their mouths look very young. The lawyer tried to count steps backward as if numbers could subtract water. A son grabbed his father's sleeve without meaning affection. One in-law shouted for the horses, which were already dancing on a distant patch of higher ground, as if the future could be shaken off their flanks. Solomon did not move, not because he enjoyed theater, but because movement is a message when a man like him is seen by men like them. Stillness made him weather. Weather does not choose. Weather arrives. The third failure nudged the last good bridge of earth, and the path to town no longer existed except as a line of bubbles marking where it had remembered being wood, long enough to rot. The overseer fell first, not all the way down, but at a new angle that made his ledger book slide from his satchel and float a moment like a paper boat. He held the book out of the water like a man saving a child by the ankle. He called names. No one answered him with words. Hands answered, and the hands were not good at forming plans where plans were called for, because these were men who believed plans were the consequence of wanting, and wanting the privilege of having. They had never been required to imagine the earth as anything but obedient. Now the earth provided instruction. A reserve will take a body gently or ungently, depending on leverage and luck. These men had neither and too much of everything else. The patriarch slipped to the thigh, then to the hip. He looked at the sky as if it were a servant late with a towel. A sun slid to the crotch and made the sound men make when they meet the world in a tender place. The lawyer coughed and swallowed silt that thought of paper and decided it had found its cousin. One in-law tried to crawl toward the dike face where rushes bowed like listeners, and the rushes did nothing except what they had always done, which is survive wind in either direction. The water did not boil or froth. It climbed them as if it were their own past returning, step by step, each tide a deed. Solomon had once seen a barrel being filled with rice. He had noticed how the grain found the shape of the barrel without hurry. pouring until the barrel was an idea rather than an object. He watched now as the reserve returned the favor, took these 9 men as a shape it had been promised long ago, and had been waiting to complete. There is a point at which a man who is sinking remembers his childhood as if the past could be negotiated like a price. The patriarch seemed to reach that point, his mouth forming a woman's name that did not belong to any of the women in his house. One son raised a hand as if to swear a truth and found the sky uninterested in oaths. The overseer, in his panic, threw the ledger to Solomon. It slapped the water and slid. Solomon reached down and lifted it. He held it like a man appraising a net. He tucked it under his arm the way men tuck a book they intend to read later on a porch painted the color of safety. The 4th failure made a sound that carried to the horses, who bolted, flinging their fear down the causeway like sparks. The 5th failure was graceful, as if a dancer had been asked to lower the curtain. By the 6th, the men were no longer 9 in a geometry. They were individual problems, each being solved by a simple equation: a weight, a suction, a measure of time, water arithmetic. Solomon whispered Leah's name and the other name she had given him. He called the names like a man inventorying what he carries into a storm. A loosened plank from a trunk bumped the patriarch's shoulder. The old man grabbed at it as if it were a verdict and pulled himself a half-foot toward a rush where the clay face of the dike stood like a wall that might listen. The plank slipped. Hands flailed in a way that reminded Solomon of eels. No one cried for God in that clear way men do in pamphlets. The cries that came were local, small-town cries for people you expect to arrive with towels and explanations. 7 and 8 were quick. The cousin's cough ended with a quiet that seemed generous. One son swung his arm in a last circle and touched nothing he had ever owned. The in-law who loved horses stared at a rippling sky and saw instead all the blue-painted ceilings of all the porches from Charleston to the sea, a line of watery heavens that meant safety to some and meant only paint to others. His mouth made a little O, as if to blow glass into a bottle and trap a thing he'd never believed in. He slid under without a splash. 9 was a different math. The overseer had clawed his way to a hummock that had ideas of its own. He put both hands on the tuft and tried to become a root. He called to Solomon using his Christian name, as if friendship belonged to men who write. Solomon looked at him the way you look at a clock that has kept you honest too long. He stepped toward the overseer, through water that agreed to part a little for a man who knew its grammar. He offered the ledger back. The overseer took it, bewildered. Then the hummock admitted it was not a promise. The overseer went down as if a trap door had been built under him by an elegant carpenter. The ledger stayed a moment on the skin of the reserve, then opened like a gray lily, then shut, then traveled slowly toward the feeder gate where something with a mouth and patience waited to take it apart. When it was finished, the reserve was a little lower and the world a little quieter. The wind turned again, bringing the city's smell, yeast and tar and old stone. A dog barked once as if it had a thought and gave up. Solomon stood on a patch of ground that had seen 9 men vanish without learning a thing. He put his hand to the dike and felt a tremor not from water now but from the earth below the earth, a rolling as if some old beast had adjusted its weight. He looked up. The first real shock came like a wave that did not respect the river's edges. The trees learned a new dance all at once. A line of swallows lifted from a wire, as if the air had spoken in a tongue meant only for them. In town, chimneys cracked like knuckles, and church spires shivered through their own reflections. The city would count its dead and place the number in the paper. Out here, numbers were for men who believed in columns. Solomon walked the perimeter in a long, slow loop, putting his heel where it needed to be to persuade a seam to hold for the night. He paid attention to the feeder gate, to the way its jaw clenched and relaxed under strain. He tightened a rope that would be called maintenance by anyone asking. He picked up a broken peg and put it in his pocket. He tilted his head and listened for Leah's 2 names, which now sounded like one name, the way 2 rivers join and pretend they were always one. He walked back to the quarters by the path that sunlight would love in a few hours when the morning came red with dust shaken down from every rafter in the county. He did not hurry. The marsh does not care for haste. In the quarters, people had already gathered where the blue-painted porch ceiling made a sky beneath the night. Old folks told the children to keep their feet off the floorboards when the shaking came again, as if that would matter. As if that would teach them something besides how to carry fright without dropping it. Someone sang a verse with no words. Someone else held a bundle that was a baby with its eyes squeezed shut, as if refusing to learn this part of the world. When Solomon stepped into the porch light, no one asked where he had been. No one asks a gatekeeper where the river went last night. He nodded toward the well, and someone went to draw water and found the rope vibrating in their hand like a taut string. He sat on the step and ran his thumb along the half-moon scar, and remembered the time the gate had bitten him in a lesson about hunger and patience. The porch ceiling looked like morning on a calm day. He imagined a spirit pressing its face to the paint and being confused, deciding to move on, to leave this house for a different house. He imagined bottles singing on a tree, each blue throat holding a small wind. He imagined 9 men under a man-made lake that would speak of them to no one. By dawn, the city would clutch its pearls and bless its survivors. The papers would use metaphors it had never earned. Men in suits would tour cracks and call them character. Engineers would argue a year and then another about where the earth had torn and why. The low country would fold this night into its long ledger of water and fire and wind. And out at the reserve, fish would nose at new silt and decide whether to call it bed or path. The feeder gate would creak with a noise it had not made before, and keep doing its job because a thing built to govern water is stubborn by nature. What changed would not be the physics. It would be a sentence in the mind of the earth, a comma added, a clause altered. The meaning shifted just enough that when a man like Solomon walked a dike he loved, he could feel in his bones that the ground now understood him. For Solomon, revenge is a word that glints like a blade and is useless for cutting reeds. What he had done felt less like revenge and more like the water being restored to itself for 15 minutes and a breath. He had taken 9 names out of the ring where they hung. He had not made a speech to the night. He had not raised a hand as if to be seen by God. He had done the work, which is to say, he had kept the grammar of the marsh honest for a span of time. The wind pressed a wet palm to the porch, and the blue ceiling glowed pale, like a reminder that sometimes protection is also a confession, that the dead are near and must be negotiated with every day, with paint if that's what is at hand, with water if that is what the land remembers, with silence if words would only bring men with numbers. When the second shock came, it knocked dust from the rafters in a fine brown curtain. People coughed and laughed at the cough to make it smaller. A bowl rattled toward the edge of a table, and a hand caught it without looking. In the hush that followed, Solomon lifted the ledger the overseer had thrust at him. The cover had softened to a suede. He opened it where the paper had stayed legible, where names were written in columns that believed themselves the whole world. He touched 9 lines with the flat of his hand and then closed the book and placed it on the sill beneath the blue, and let the morning pick out the raised letters with light. Some debts are entries you erase from the page to make the account true. He would not burn it. Paper burns fast. Water reads slower. By the time the sun rose properly, the reserve wore a new shoreline, a delicate mouthful missing, as if a god had taken a sip. The horses on the causeway had found a patch of dry that would keep their hooves honest until a boy came to halter them. The city would send men to look for 9 who had disappeared between a supper and a morning. The men sent would stand on the dike and dispute what wood means when wood swells, what mud means when mud remembers. They would not call the reserve by its truer name. Some in the quarters would trade glances that were not surprise. Stories would begin, not as accusations but as weather reports. This is how the wind turned. This is how the ground spoke. This is how the water found what it was owed. If there is a ghost here, it is not a man with a hat standing at the foot of a bed. It is the insistence of the marsh to be called by its old name. It is the blue of a porch that remembers 100 lips whispering, not asking for salvation, but asking for a night's sleep without visitation. It is a gate that bites once and teaches. It is a ledger gone soft in the hands of a man who refuses to confuse numbers with meaning. It is the city learning that stone has a patience humans lack, and that patience will sometimes spend itself all at once like a bank failing. It is Leah's two names becoming one and worn into the path until feet carry them without effort. It is 9 men in a shape the water had always been saving space for. When Solomon finally stood, the day had bent itself into usefulness. Work would be called, and he would answer. The reserve needed tending to wear its new mouth without tearing. The trunks needed oil. The dikes needed a certain kind of glance that is also a touch. He set the ledger beneath a folded cloth, a small shade for a book that had learned something about weather. He stepped down from the porch, and the ground, for an instant, gave a little hello through the soles of his feet, as if to say, "It is done for now. It is never done. Walk anyway." September 2nd, 1886. Charleston County, South Carolina. Dawn came in a dusty veil, the air still tasting of brick and lime as if the city had been filed down in the night and blown across the marsh, and the pluff mud breathed its familiar rotten egg hymn from under the Spartina, a smell locals called home even when home was trembling. The marsh clicked and whispered with unseen throats, snapping shrimps, fiddlers, and the soft glassy hum that rides a neap tide, while aftershocks padded through the low country like a big animal trying not to wake a child. The night's ledger wasn't only in the newspapers counting broken chimneys. Out here the account was in the banks and sluices and the new quiet under the reserve. The water held its secret the way the city held its breath. The earthquake didn't end. It thinned and returned in pulses that made door frames argue and made the old people squint at rafters as if reading cracks like palms. And over the next weeks, the earth kept a stuttering memory, more than 400 little reminders that balance is a verb and not a state. People dragged mattresses into yards, made tents of quilts, and stared at the blue-painted porch ceilings from the outside now, trusting a color meant to trick spirits to keep watch over sleeping under stars. When a tremor came at daybreak, chickens went silent, then spoke all at once like a jury changing its mind. In town, men counted 2/3 of buildings harmed and named the damage with bricklayer words. Out here, damage was a shoreline taking a new bite, and the slow way a feeder gate changed its voice after a hard night. Solomon walked the dikes before the sun got ideas about heat, putting his palm to the seams as if feeling a pulse in a wrist, listening for the way water carries a story when pressed, because a reserve after an event tells where it gave and where it lied. The new scallop along the bank looked like a careful bite, as if a god with small teeth had nibbled and then rinsed its mouth, and the silt wore an unfamiliar pattern, a lace blown across mud by a wind that had been in town among toppled cornices. The marsh returned to work without complaint. Gulls wrote their loud script in the margins, herons stood like judges, and the pluff mud exhaled its old chemistry, hydrogen sulfide rising from low-oxygen worlds where little lives break big things down. The stench a proof that rot feeds life in this parish of water. Word traveled in a way that didn't use names. A boy found riderless horses at the far end of a causeway, with their eyes showing white and their hooves clean in a way that meant panic had been the groom. And a woman told a cousin that the men who liked to count weren't at their counting places, and the cousin said nothing out loud, but changed the way she looked at the river as if expecting it to answer if spoken to right. Charleston's committees formed with the brittle speed of men who prefer minutes and stamps. An executive relief group scribbled, tallied, and wrote the city back into sentences even while the earth corrected their punctuation with a rolling shrug. Some of those men would come upriver to take a look at what water can be when unadvised, squinting at levees and calling them embankments, pointing at cuts and calling them failures, never saying the word promise. The quarters lived by different arithmetic. The old folks tapped door frames and porch posts and listened like doctors, then nodded toward paint that was the color of a morning sky. The old haint blue put there to fool what wanders and to tell a certain kind of visitor that water already rings this house. Move along. Bottle trees chimed when the wind lifted, blue throats singing, each glass mouth a little jail the sun could open at dawn. Stories tied the practice to ancestors who crossed seas and brought ways to speak with what cannot be seen, and even those who rolled their eyes at ghost talk still slept easier beneath the blue. the way a soldier sleeps beneath a familiar prayer. He doesn't say anymore. When the first men from town arrived, their boots tested the causeway like strangers asking for directions. They brought a borrowed engineer's gaze and a merchant's hunger, and they asked for an overseer who could explain the reserve like a ledger. No overseer came. They scanned the rim where reeds bowed and found nothing more than wind gestures. They wanted the comfort of a villain or a storm, something with a clean name. The reserve offered silt lines, a torn angle, and silence. One man squatted to pinch mud and smelled the city's bad breath on his fingers, the lime and dust, and said something about settlement and subsidence in a voice that wanted to be the last word. He didn't hear the marsh clicking its own language through snapping things in the shallows. A percussive murmur like rain turned inside out. They asked Solomon questions without looking at him well, the way men talk to a gate without thank you. Water height, they said. Trunk soundness, they said. The timing of floods, the pattern of aftershocks, whether the north culvert was clear. He answered in sentences that fit in their ears and saved the real speech for the palm against wood, for the thumb on a swollen peg, for the listening done with feet. He showed them a board that had lifted and sat back, which to their eyes meant repair, and to his meant decision. They wrote notes with pencils that left hungry gray on damp paper, while the reserve held its breath, and the fiddler crabs lifted their little fists from their burrows like punctuation marks. In town, the churches wore bandages and brave faces. St. Michael's and St. Philip's rang uneven bells to prove their throats still worked, and people gathered under stars because roofs had learned to sigh and tilt. Telegraph wires hummed with worry, and the newspapers printed the reach of the shock like a boast, Boston to New Orleans, Cuba to Bermuda, and the figure that satisfied the part of the brain that likes sums. About 60 dead, countless cracked. Then they printed something calmer a fortnight later, claiming the earth had struck its balance, which comforted readers who wanted the world to be a ledger closed at month's end. The Low Country, being older and wetter than print, continued its particular breathing and saved its truer numbers for the tide. At night, the bottle trees sang again, and someone on the porch told what the blue above meant to the old ones, tricking haints with sky, stopping boo-hags at the threshold, a boundary the color of water because there are rules even for things that wander. A child asked if paint could lie to a ghost, and an elder said paint doesn't lie. It declares a treaty. The marsh popped and crackled in the dark like a low fire turned sideways, the shrimp chorus coming up through the boards, and even those who scorned the old protections felt their shoulders drop a little under that false sky. Solomon kept the overseer's ledger under a cloth on his sill, its softened cover taking the imprint of his thumb when lifted. He turned pages that believed themselves holy and laid his hand flat over columns that made people inventory. He didn't cross names out. That would be ceremony he didn't need. He watched the paper drink humidity and release it, the way rice drinks a flood and then lets it go. He thought about how paper and silt share a destiny if left without hands to fuss at them. He thought about how some accounts are trued by subtraction that looks like disappearance and feels like weather. Outside, a small aftershock loosened dust again, and in the brief hush afterward, the blue ceiling above the porch looked like pond water seen from underneath. Word came that searchers were combing reaches of the river, dragging and calling, finding bits of tack and a ledger leaf curled like a shell, but no bodies that could be named without argument. The marsh keeps what it is given when the gift is made correctly, and the reserve is a careful mouth when it chooses to be. The men from town returned with a theory about weak soils and poor compaction, and the need for improved supervision once the city finished counting its broken places. They said supervision the way men say mercy when they mean control. The causeway, having learned a lesson it could not phrase, held. The old ones in the quarters nodded less and watched more. Bottle trees were fed new blue throats, and some folks painted not just ceilings but door frames and window sashes, making a perimeter of sky and wood grain. There were whispers about a boo-hag riding after the shocks, a thing that slips a skin and hunts breath when sleep is thin, but the blue at the eaves and the glass that caught the wind made people breathe deeper. Not every gullus soul agreed on the why of the color, but enough remembered the feel of it to keep a brush moving. The blue wasn't proof, it was a posture. Solomon returned to work that didn't say his name, oiling a hinge, seating a peg, shaving a swollen jamb so a gate could learn to be obedient without losing its voice. He read the reserve like a long sentence that had lost a comma and wanted one back. He knew that men in coats would declare a repair complete when the angle looked right from a road, but water reads in currents, not lines. He stood where Leah had taught him to stand to hear a trunk's true talk, a little upcurrent, on the firmest seam of earth, and listened to how the gate took the tide's question and answered with a creak that had changed key since the night the nine went down. When the city's relief men left, they left promises like handbills and carried away a story that put the hard part on the ground, not on the choices. And the newspapers liked that story fine. They do not print what the marsh says. They do not print the way pluff mud clings, the way it holds a boot until the boot remembers its weight and admits it. They do not print the way a bottle hum can calm a child who has learned that houses can shiver like dogs. They do not print the way blue persuades fear to pass over a threshold like a polite guest who recognizes a sign in a language he forgot he knew. After a week of aftershocks that grew shy and then bold again at odd hours, one at 1 in the morning, another at 5, the quarters settled into a new kind of night where sleep was a negotiation and the marsh was a choir under everything. Solomon kept walking the same loops at dawn and dusk, pressing his heel into soft places with a tenderness that looked like habit to anyone who didn't know the vocabulary of seams. He carried tools that always looked like farm work, and always were, and he carried the ledger under his arm sometimes when the sky hinted rain, as if paper too deserved a walk under blue. The city said the earth had struck her balance and people nodded in church, grateful for sentences that end, but the low country keeps ellipses in its pocket. The reserve, having eaten 9, did not brag. It wore its new mouth modestly and fed the same birds at the same hours. The dikes held with the look of men who lean against a post as if resting when in fact they are holding the porch up for the night. The names that had been heavy in Solomon eased in his chest the way weight eases when repositioned rather than removed, and when he laid the ledger back beneath its cloth, he did so with the same care as setting a sleeping infant down under a sky painted to invite peace. September 14th, 1886, Charleston County, South Carolina. The morning broke in a gauze of heat, the kind that lays over the marsh like a damp sheet, sweet with pluff mud and iron and last night's lightning smell, as if the earth had been soldered back together in the dark and was still cooling. Aftershocks had turned shy these past days, then returned at odd hours with a cat's soft paws, and the river kept sighing like a sleeper rehearsing a bad dream. While gulls sketched their loud signatures in the air over Spartina that ticked in cricket language no one from town knew how to read. The city had resumed the habits of paper, minutes, ledgers, relief rolls, yet the low country still wore its fear under the skin, a hum beneath boards and blue-painted eaves, where folks laid eyes upward for luck they could name. A letter reached the plantation in a stiff envelope slick with town, bearing the crest that had once hung like a small sun on a trunk post, summoning a head count and an explanation in the tidy diction of men who believe questions are nets that always bring fish. It spoke of a committee's patience and an engineer's certainty, cited subsidence and weak soils, set a date for a tour, and closed with a line that treated the reserve like a misbehaving clock to be wound and set right by the same hands that had never turned its works. People in the quarters watched the envelope cross the yard like a wasp, and the old ones nodded in a way that meant the river would be asked to testify without being allowed to speak. Solomon laid the overseer's ledger open on his sill under the folded cloth, the pages breathing in the humidity and breathing it out, the way a marsh drinks tide and returns it altered, and he traced the grooves where a hand had pressed hard on numbers that once thought they were facts. A warped leaf had curled like a shell. He touched it the way a man touches the lip of a bottle on a tree to hear whether it remembers last night's wind. Out on the porch, the blue above wore a thin scum of dust shaken from rafters by the earth stutters, and someone had repainted the corner where a spider had built a dark argument. One stroke of sky pushing back a room where dreaming things might slip in. The tour came at low tide, the hour when truth shows ribs. 3 men from town rode out with a surveyor who kept his eyes on a brass instrument as if the world were a sum waiting to be aligned, and a clerk whose pencil made a lean gray that roofs and damp favored. They stepped onto the causeway, boots seeking the firm syllables of earth, and followed the familiar path where gnats hesitate, the reserve lying to their right, like a polished plate set for a guest who had already eaten what mattered. They pointed with careful hands, named failures, prescribed fill and plank and nail, said compaction and regrade and inspection schedule, and the clerk recorded each word as if writing a spell that could keep water from remembering itself. Solomon walked them as a man walks a doctor through a body he already knows, showing seams with his heel, letting his palm rest on the dike's flank where the pulse was honest, and stopping at the scalloped bite the reserve had taken the night the sky said no. He answered questions by measure and season, not by oath, telling them how trunks swell in brackish heat, how pegs soften then harden with the breathing of the tide, how Pluff mud holds a boot until a man remembers his weight and admits it. The surveyor frowned at words that declined to be numbers, and the clerk's pencil hesitated when a gull screamed at the precise instant a tiny aftershock tapped the path, a reminder with no respect for schedules. They asked about the missing. Their voices flattened at the edges, making the question tidy, and the marsh went on popping and clicking, the shrimp chorus working beneath the language of men, while herons stood like opinions, and the wind turned a bottle on its wire in the quarters, so that a blue throat sang one clear note. Solomon gestured to the water, the way a man gestures to a church when a stranger asks where the prayers went, and he named the current and the mouth and the places where silt writes its own law at the turn. He did not supply the comfort of bodies or the convenience of blame. He offered the grammar of the reserve, which is to say, he offered what had actually happened in the only tongue that stays true out here. The committee man reached for certainty, the way a drowning man reaches for a name, proposing a new alignment of the bank that would straighten a curve the river loved, a run of pilings that would teach water obedience, and an oversight regime that put men with pencils on the path twice a week until memory forgot itself. The words fell onto the mud like dry seed, and the surveyor nodded as if nodding could be a bridge. Solomon's eyes drifted to where Leah had been laid near the old cypress stump, that quiet joint of trunk and dike where the ground keeps counsel. He could feel, in the heel, in the wrist scar, the reserve's slow refusal to become a drawing. He led them at last to the feeder gate, the wooden throat whose voice had changed since the night the 9 went down, and he pulled the lever partway so the gate could speak for itself. A creak, a note lower than before, like a singer finding a new key after grief. The water took the narrow with a soft, teeth-on-wood sound and eddied along the bite the reserve had made, drawing a pattern on the surface like writing that only marsh eyes can read. The surveyor's instrument blinked sun back into his face. The clerk shielded the page. The committee man named the soundware and proposed iron. The gate closed like a sigh. That evening the quarters gathered under the blue again, wind enough to ring the bottles in a minor key, and the elders told the children what the color had done in other storms, how it confuses a haint, how it makes a boo-hag consider a longer road, how it marks a house as claimed by water and therefore unsuitable for things that hate crossing. The young rolled their eyes and then slept closer to the paint, the way a man skeptical of prayer still stands when the hymn begins, because standing is in the bones. Out beyond the porch, the marsh kept its patient percussion, shrimp snapping like carefully spaced rain under wood that remembered shaking, and a late tremor passed like a big man tiptoeing across a room, hoping not to wake what he had already woken. In town, the newspapers announced that rebuilding would proceed with modern method, iron ties, new mortar, better spans, and they printed the reach of the great shock again, as if distance were comfort. Boston to New Orleans, ships at sea feeling the heave, and they lauded the executive relief men who turned calamity into columns and pledges. The same page carried a smaller line about a missing party up tide presumed lost to the river, and the letters in that line looked thinner than the rest, as if even ink knew when to keep quiet. Charleston resumed sounding like itself. Hammer, psalm, wheel, rumor. Solomon oiled the gate as if oiling a throat and ran his thumb across the half-moon scar that had taught him patience, and he set the ledger back beneath its cloth, the paper remembering his hand and letting go, rice field humidity making each page breathe like a small animal asleep. He walked the dike once more under a sky that had traded blue for a tarnished coin of moon, pausing where the earth's seam felt honest and where it felt vain, and he put his heel down lightly, the way a man steps on a name he loves so as not to scuff it. Behind him, the bottles sounded like a choir made of glass and weather. Before him, the reserve waited for tide with a patience learned over centuries, keeping what it had been given without brag, teaching any who listened that balance is not peace, it is work. October 3rd, 1886, Charleston County, South Carolina. The air carried a thinner heat and a cleaner edge, the marsh smelling of pluff mud and iron and the faint sweet of decay braided into salt. A perfume that tells the low country the year is loosening its grip on summer without quite letting go. Aftershocks had grown into a superstition more than a schedule, arriving like uninvited kin. A tap through floorboards here, a soft groan in rafters there, while over the Spartina, the gulls drew ragged signatures and the shrimp chorus stitched its invisible percussion into the water's skin. The city wore scaffolds like splints and spoke fluently again in ledgers and minutes, but out where trunks breathed and dikes kept their slow counsel, the earth still hummed underfoot, as if remembering the night it changed its mind. A final letter came folded small as if discretion could shrink consequence, stamped with the city's confidence and the committee's seal, noting that the missing were now called lost, and the reserve's edge would be straightened and disciplined by iron and fill as soon as crews and budgets returned from more visible wounds in town. It closed with a line that called the accident "act of God," and advised renewed supervision and written routines, the way men make spells out of paper when they mistrust the weather. In the quarters, the old ones nodded like cypress in light wind, and a woman on the porch touched the blue above with the tip of a brush, renewing a corner where sun had worn the treaty thin. Solomon walked the paths before first light, the way a man checks the locks on a house where history sleeps light, pressing his palm to seams, listening to the gate's new key, and reading the tide's handwriting along the fresh bite the reserve had taken. The pluff mud lifted its egg-sour hymn, hydrogen sulfide rising from the low oxygen labors beneath, proof that rot is a kind of work, and the marsh a patient factory, where small mouths turn yesterday into tomorrow. Herons stood in their collars of fog like magistrates uninterested in cases already decided, and fiddler crabs flashed their little declarations and vanished, punctuation under a sentence no clerk could take down. By mid-morning, a quiet procession came upriver, men in coats unseasonable for the weather, a skiff carrying 2 city hands and 1 minister whose collar held the exactness of print. They paused at the causeway where the path narrows and the wind makes gnats think twice, removed their hats as if entering a sanctuary, and asked, politely, stiffly, for a moment, to mark the lost. The minister's prayer was tidy as a column, God named with the good pen, the river called witness and comforter in the same breath. The water received the words without remark, lapping at the bite in a rhythm older than comfort. The clerk wrote a line in the book he carried, date and hour and witness, then shut the covers like a lid. They asked Solomon if the gate would bear a heavier brace when crews returned with iron and will. He answered with season and swell, and the way brackish water makes wood remember and forget, explained that a gate sings truer when allowed a little give, the way a chest breathes easier when a belt isn't cinched to vanity. The city men liked iron the way frightened men like rules. They nodded and wrote and promised and turned back toward noises that meant rebuilding and praise. The minister glanced once more at the reserve with a face that wanted to understand and settled for faith, then followed the hats down the causeway. Evening came with a wind that made the bottle trees talk in a minor key, blue throats ringing soft at the porch edge where the sky color had been freshly laid. The elders told the children again the reason for the hue, how haints confuse a painted ceiling for mourning, how boo-hags dislike crossings and balk at a door that declares itself water, how a house wrapped in that false firmament is a house that has already negotiated with what wanders. Some of the young rolled eyes and still slept closer to the color, because bodies believe older than minds. The shrimp popped in the creek like a small careful fire, and the boards hummed with a memory that no aftershock could rattle out. In town, the papers finished the story the way city papers do, with a map of damage and a poem of gratitude and a promise of better methods, iron ties, new mortar, wiser spans, plus a last narrow line about the missing upriver, presumed taken by the river's complicated appetite. They reprinted the reach of the great shock like a testament, Boston to New Orleans, ships at sea feeling the heave, and praised the executive relief men for turning calamity into committees. Charleston's noise returned. Hammer, wheel, psalm, rumor, and the steady clink of coin trying to buy back balance. Solomon sat under the blue and opened the overseer's ledger one last time, the paper breathing swamp air, the columns still doing their thin arithmetic, and he placed his palm flat across 9 lines that had once believed they were ownership. He did not cross them out. Erasure is a ceremony for men who need to see a thing vanish. He closed the book and wrapped it in cloth and set it on the sill where morning finds it without fail. A small reliquary not for numbers but for an understanding. That water keeps what it is given when given correctly. That dikes hold when loved and listened to. That gates speak and deserve answers. Outside, a small tremor padded past the way a big man tiptoes, ashamed. Before first frost, the reserve learned its new mouth, edges calloused by tide, birds taking the same perch they had taken before, as if the world had resumed its habit while quietly improving its aim. The causeway wore the memory of hooves that had fled and returned, and the path where the committee liked to walk settled into a firmness that told knees the truth. Work went on with a decency that refuses applause. Oil the hinge, shave the jamb, read the seam, mind the tide. Balance did not become peace. It remained a craft. If there was a haunting, it lived in the color of the porch ceiling and the glass that sang when wind learned a new word. In the way pluff mud clung and released a boot only when the wearer admitted his weight. In the gate's deeper note and the way a man's heel felt a seam's honesty through leather. The 9 did not walk the banks at night. The reserve had taken them as form and kept the form modestly, a lesson swallowed and not preached. The marsh did the preaching, which is to say it went on, older than ledgers and newer than paint. Precise as the chemistry that makes rot feed life, and life build work, and work become a prayer under a false morning sky. On a still noon weeks later, Solomon stood where Leah rested, that joint of dike and trunk and stump where water and wood and earth keep counsel, and laid his hand on the ground long enough for the pulse to answer. He said her 2 names and then the one they had become, not aloud, but in the place where breath and patience meet, and the reserve lapped once against the bite it had made, a small amen in the only language that matters here. He turned back toward the blue eve and the bottle choir, and the work that would outlast men in minutes, the marsh underfoot speaking its steady grammar, the city behind him with its scaffolds and vows, and between them the quiet arithmetic of water making good on what it is owed. October 18th, 1886, Charleston County, South Carolina. Morning rose thin and bright, a clean-edged light raking over Spartina-tipped silver as pins, the air salted with pluff mud and the faint iron breath of wet wood, as if the marsh had taken inventory and found everything in its place, except what it had chosen to keep. Aftershocks had thinned to rumor and habit, a soft settling through rafters at odd hours, and the river wore its calm like a well-buttoned coat, the shrimp chorus ticking under the surface like a careful clock that belongs to no house and keeps all houses honest. In town, hammers spoke fluently again. Out here, gates cleared their throats in the lower key they had learned. Dikes held their seams with the quiet pride of work done daily and without applause. Charleston wrote itself back into columns, executive relief minutes filed, pledges tallied, Scaffolds counted like ribs healed, and printed the great reach of the shock one last time for those who sleep better with distances listed like litany. Boston to New Orleans, Cuba to Bermuda, ships rolling in testimony on open water. A smaller line, thin as a vein, closed the ledger on the missing upriver, presumed taken by the river's old appetite. The ink looked paler there, as if even type respected the marsh's privacy when water keeps what it is given correctly. The city moved its weight from sorrow to schedule, and the Low Country resumed its elder grammar, each tide a stanza and each bottle tree a bell choir small enough to fit on a porch and large enough to hold the wind. The reserve's new mouth wore a neat callus by first chill, tide polishing the bite into a curve the river could love without boasting, fish nosing the fresh silt as if reading news written just for them. Fiddlers flagged from their doorways and vanished like good punctuation. Herons took the same bony stations they always had, magistrates over the docket of shallows, while the pluff mud lifted its sulfur hymn, that egg-sour assurance that rot is labor, and labor is the marsh's oldest prayer. Along the causeway, a stretch of earth remembered hooves and men and did not name them, keeping silence the way water keeps a face until wind asks it to speak. The crew from town arrived at last with iron and will and a plan drawn straight enough to please a ruler, staking a new line the river would be asked to learn, and the surveyor squinted through brass until the world narrowed into numbers that fit, while the clerk's pencil left a hungry gray that damp boards enjoy. They braced, they filled, they drove pilings like sentences hammered to end in a period, and the gate accepted the brace with the weary humor of a chest allowed to breathe if the belt sits one notch loose, singing still in the lower register grief had given it. When the committee men left, they carried the comfort of completion, and the reserve accepted this too, as one more weather that would change when weather changed. Under the blue-painted ceilings, a few new brushstrokes dried to the color of shallow morning, sealing a hairline where sun had worried the treaty thin, and the bottle trees wore fresh throats that rang sweet when a north breeze sifted the yard. Children learned the old story clean. Haints fooled by sky, boo-hags balking at crossings, houses circled by watercolor as a boundary with manners. And even the skeptics slept with their shoulders lower beneath that fabricated heaven, because bodies understand treaties long before minds write them down. Night kept the shrimp's percussive fire under the floor, and the boards no longer trembled so much as remembered trembling, which is a gentler thing. Solomon walked his loops, heel on seam, palm on flank, ear tuned to the feeder's consonants, reading the reserve like a sentence that had been revised without losing its meaning, and the half-moon scar at his wrist itched on damp mornings the way old lessons do when work is near. He oiled the hinge, shaved the jam, seated the peg, and stepped off the dike at dusk as the moon traded places with a rinsed blue sky, leaving behind him the small exact labors that keep large dangerous things in conversation rather than in revolt. The ledger stayed wrapped on the sill beneath a folded cloth, breathing rice field humidity and letting the columns fade by degrees a clerk would notice and a marsh would not. When a final service came, brief words, hats in hands, a minister whose collar held the city straight, a prayer was set upon the water with the good pen, and the river answered in ripples too slight to count, which is the only grammar the reserve ever uses for amen. The clerk wrote date and hour and the names of those who witnessed, then closed the book as if sealing a jar, while a gull's ragged signature tore the sky and the surveyor folded his brass like a gentleman tucking away an instrument that has told him what he wanted to hear. The men went back toward the noises that mean praise and pay. The marsh went back to sentences older than either. If a haunting lingered, it lived not as a figure at the foot of a bed, but as color and chemistry and note. The false morning overhead that persuades wandering things to keep walking. The sulfur breath of pluff mud that insists decay builds tomorrow. The gate's lowered voice that teaches patience by tone. The nine did not gather on banks. The reserve kept their geometry modestly and without sermon, proof that justice here prefers the slow arithmetic of tide to the spectacle of torches. The Low Country, precise as ever, made prayer out of work and work out of memory, and the city, full of scaffolds and vows, learned again what balance means when land is a thin idea floating on water's old mind. On a clear noon, Solomon stood where Leah rests, at the joint of trunk, dike, and stump where water, wood, and earth hold counsel, and set his hand to the ground long enough to feel the quiet answer climb into his palm. He said her two names, and then the one they had become, not aloud, because out here the grammar is tide and wind and a man's heel on an honest seam, and the reserve put a single small lick against the calloused curve of its new mouth, a reply no clerk could bind and no minister could improve. He turned toward the blue eve and the glass choir, and the day's small tasks that keep large stories true, and the marsh, old and exact, breathed in and breathed out like a book that does not close.